need to do. Hello, everyone. I'm George Hanlon. I'm Director of Grants at Indiana Humanities. I want to thank you for joining us on this webinar to talk about our Wilma Gibbs Moore Fellowship. I want to let you know we are recording the webinar, so just be aware of that. I'm going to actually turn my camera off as I present, so I can focus on the slides. I will say that at any time during the webinar, if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat. My colleague Megan Teligman, who's Director of Programs, is behind the scenes. She's going to monitor the chat. She may be very well able to answer your questions right then and there. If not, she will find time during breaks in my presentation to share the questions with us, and we can go over them as well. I'm honored today. We've got a couple of guests, Jordan Ryan and Jasmine Sutton. They both received fellowships back in our 2020 class. So I'm going to spend about 20 minutes here talking about the goals of the fellowship, and we're going to review the process for applying. And then comes the fun part where Jordan and Jasmine are going to spend about 10 or 15 minutes each, and they're going to talk about their work, and hopefully their examples will inspire you and give you some ideas on research projects that you can undertake. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera now, and we will focus on moving forward. So you see today's agenda. Again, we're going to talk about the fellowship and review the process for applying, and then talk to Jordan and Jasmine. Let's just dig into things, and I'll start my part by giving you a little bit of background around the fellowship. Indiana Humanities introduced the Wilma Gibbs Moore Fellowship back in the summer of 2020 with the goal of supporting new humanities research that explores anti-Black racial injustice and structural racism in Indiana, and also that considers how Black Hoosiers have responded. This, of course, was the summer when George Floyd was murdered, and we were seeing protests, and we were really thinking about how important it is for the humanities to provide context and understanding around issues related to racial injustice and structural racism, and how the humanities can play an important role in bringing people together to explore difficult conversations and difficult topics and have difficult conversations. And so that's really where we were thinking when we introduced these fellowships back in the summer of 2020. We named the fellowships after Wilma Gibbs Moore. She was a longtime librarian and archivist at the Indiana Historical Society. She edited the IHS's publication, Black History News and Notes. I had the honor of working with Wilma for 11 years when I was at the Indiana Historical Society. I know some of you on this webinar probably have had the chance to interact and know her well. We all know Wilma agree that she was the preeminent scholar of Indiana African-American history, and a wonderful woman all around, and we're glad to honor her with this fellowship. If you've looked at the fellowship materials, you already know this, but I will just take now to reiterate that the fellowship does provide a research stipend. This year is going to be $5,000. When we first introduced it back in 2020, it was $2,500, but as we grow the program, we realized that more money allows greater research, so we're now offering a $5,000 scholarship. We'll go ahead and look at the goals of the grant, or the fellowship rather. This is all spelled out in the call for proposals, which is on our website. If you've not looked at that call for proposals, I encourage you to do so. The materials that I present today are all spelled out in that call for proposals, so I'm simply reiterating what's already out there, but hopefully by going over it, it can reinforce some of these ideas, and again, can give you the chance to ask some questions. We worked with a team of scholars to develop the guidelines, the call for proposals for the fellowship. And so I'm going to go through 6 overarching goals that we came up with working with those scholars. The first 2 are somewhat related. We really want this fellowship to support research that helps understand how Black how Black Hoosiers have responded to racial injustice and structural racism through creative arts or involvement in politics and economic and social programs at the neighborhood, city, or state level. And I would actually add perhaps even the national level. We also want to increase the knowledge of Black Hoosiers' strategies for overcoming racial injustice and structural racism over time. And I will say that these 2 points are somewhat important to emphasize. When we were working with the scholars and defining the goals, they really wanted to have an element of this focus on how have Black people responded. We don't just want this to be all a recounting of the injustices done towards Black, but to empower the Black voices in this narrative and really use the research to elevate how Blacks have responded. So as you're developing your research proposal, keep that in mind. We, of course, want to use this fellowship to increase the amount of humanities scholarship that looks at the causes and effects of racial injustice and structural racism in Indiana. So we fully understand that. We want to use the research to analyze the decisions, policies, and actions that created racial inequality in the past and possibly in the present as well. And then we want to elevate the voice of Hoosiers in the narrative. We want to look at Black Hoosiers and the role they played again, and the role that they played in regional and national historiographies of racial injustice and structural racism. Sort of as a corollary, we want to then emphasize the use of Indiana-based archives and collections that tell the Black story and elevate them so more people are aware of them, so more people use them. More people in the future may be able to utilize those resources that you bring to the surface. Now, I will say that as you look at the goals and you develop your proposal, you may not have a proposal that touches on all of these goals, but your proposal should at least touch on some of them. And so when you develop it, keep that in mind, because the reviewers do go back as they're assessing your ideas. They look and see how closely they align with the goals. So keeping the goals in the forefront as you develop your proposal will be important. In terms of what you focus your research on, it's really wide-ranging as long as it focuses on the fields of the humanities. So it could be looking at history or literature, philosophy, cultural studies, religious studies, art history, folklore, ethnomusicology, and even gender studies. Really, it runs a wide gamut of what you look at. It could also even be looking at social sciences such as political science, sociology, or anthropology, as long as you use a humanistic lens to look at those topics. And I will say last time when we looked at the proposals, one of the proposals did not get accepted because the reviewers felt that it was purely political science and looking more at data, and it really didn't bring in the humanistic elements of adding context and insights through a humanistic lens. So keep that in mind. We really want the humanities focus, especially if you look in some of these more traditional non-humanities areas. And if you have questions about that, I encourage you to reach out to me. I have my email address at the end of the presentation. I'm always glad to talk. I believe my email address is in the call for proposals as well. But really, we're open to a broad range of topics, keeping in mind that it does have to align with the goals of helping us understand racial injustice and racial structural racism in Indiana. I'll pause now to see if there are any questions. It doesn't look like there are any in the chat, but if you do want to throw out some questions now, go ahead and populate them in the chat, and Megan can either answer them or call them out to me. But since I don't see any, we'll go ahead and move on. Yes?
We do have one question.
Oh, we do have one question. Okay.
Yeah, in the Q&A tab. Will you be sharing an example of the proposal that was selected?
I can share an example of a proposal if I get permission. I would want to get permission from one of the fellows and not share their work without getting their okay. But what I would say is email me, and then I will see if one of the scholars is willing to share it. We do have Jordan and Jasma on the webinar today, and they're going to talk through their projects. And then if you're interested perhaps in one of theirs, I can get their permission. So email me and I'll see what I can do about that.
One more question in the chat there, George, if you can see that.
Okay, does it include scientific and medical? Again, I would say science and medicine are not humanities topics, so make it have a humanistic lens. So I don't know exactly what you're thinking about, but let's just say, okay, let's say it has something to do with how Black people have traditionally been underserved in the medical community. I would not put the focus more on just simply a contemporary view of that, but taking a humanistic lens and saying, okay, historically, this is how Blacks have been underserved, do some research and collections around the history of it, and again, put maybe a contemporary spin through a historical lens. So I will say that science and medicine in and of themselves they're scientific topics, not humanities. So we will want to look again at that context through a humanities lens. But I can, again, email me and I can talk to you a little bit greater in depth. It's kind of hard for me to take sort of a hypothetical situation and provide some sound advice around that. All right. So let's look now at topics of interest. We do spell out some potential ideas in the call for proposals. This is not all encompassing. You can definitely come up with your own ideas, but here were some examples that we've thrown out in the guidelines just to get you thinking. Potential topics could include looking at institutional barriers for African Americans in the realm of politics, the economy, or the cultural life of Indiana. You could look at patterns of migration and urbanization that shaped Black communities, and conversely, how deindustrialization or urban renewal and other movements affected it on the other end. You could look at literary and artistic works by Black Hoosiers as they relate to themes of structural racism and racial injustice, potentially even policing and or protest. You could look at the history and analysis of policing and incarceration of Black Hoosiers. An important area may be the long civil rights movement as it unfolded in Indiana, including its goals, tactics, achievements, and setbacks. And I will add that you could potentially look at participants, Black Hoosiers who are leaders in the civil rights movement. And we've had some wonderful leaders in that movement whose stories may need to be told. You could potentially look at Black codes and other laws that contributed to racial inequality. Jordan did that with their look at redlining in Indianapolis specifically, and we're going to have Jordan talk to us about that. You could also then take primary source documents and add interpretive analysis. So again, these are just some topics of interest to us, but these are not all inclusive. You can definitely come up with your own ideas. Again, tying it to the goals, tying it to this idea of looking at racial injustice and structural racism in Indiana. There are some requirements that I want to point out to you. Again, I'm sort of beating this down a lot, but make sure that the research that you propose ties to the goals of the grant. And make sure that the proposal has a significant tie to Indiana. It has to have an Indiana connection. That doesn't mean that it can't be of national interest, but there has to be some connection to the Hoosier State. There are two requirements that I especially want to call to your attention because these are important as you develop your proposal and you present it to us. First of all, in your proposal, you're going to have to present a plan for disseminating your research through scholarly vehicles. This could be a presentation at a conference. It could be publication in a peer-reviewed journal. It could be publication through an academic press, but you have to come up with a plan for getting this information out through scholarly vehicles. In addition, we want to make sure that your research is accessible to the public. So we ask you to come up with a plan and present ideas on how you're going to get this out to the population at large, the general public. And this could be through lectures or talks. You could maybe develop a podcast or appear on radio programs. Maybe you create some sort of interactive website or an exhibit. You might work with the Indiana Historical Bureau to do a historical marker. You have to have some plan. Now, I will say this, you don't have to have these ideas well developed. They don't have to be like firm. I think that's unreasonable. If we're giving you a fellowship to do research over a year, we don't expect you to come up with, oh, XYZ, I'm doing this and this and this, but you do have to come up with a plan and some ideas of how you're going to propose to get that information out there. So that's going to be important first, because we want the public to engage in this information. We don't want this research just to sit on a shelf somewhere. In order to be eligible, you should be affiliated with a research institution. Maybe you're a full-time or adjunct faculty, or maybe you're a graduate student obtaining your master's degree or PhD. You could also be a curator or a librarian or archivist at a research archive or collection. You could also be an independent scholar. If you are an independent scholar and you're not affiliated with a research organization, then you should submit information that explains your credibility as a researcher. We will ask you to submit your CV. So make sure that on your CV that's clear. And if you need to explain that in your proposal, you can do so. We do allow research teams to apply. If you do that, you need to identify your principal investigator, and that should be a bona fide scholar. Then you should also identify your other team members and explain how those people are qualified to carry out the work. This last round, we did give a fellowship to a research team based at IUPUI. The other 3 that we awarded were to scholars. This last point, if you're applying as an individual, you need to be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. If you're applying on behalf of a research team, I would assume that that's through an organization, and that organization should be a tax-exempt organization. That could include a college or a university or library or something like that. We cannot give funds to for-profit organizations, so I want to point that out. There are some restrictions to what we can fund, and I will say upfront that there is a lot of gray area around this, especially when you're researching topics that are related to racial injustice and structural racism. So I will acknowledge there's some gray area, but generally speaking, because we are using federal funds to support Indiana Humanities work, we have to try it as much as possible not to fund work that advocates for a political position, that promotes a particular political or religious or ideological point of view. We can't promote religious practices or training. We really, as much as possible, need to focus on the facts, although I will acknowledge in this day and age, certain people think the facts are advocating. So just keep that in mind and try to avoid as much as possible in the work that you do to not lean toward too much advocacy. A couple of activities are prohibited. We do not want you to use the funds for printing costs for publication of books or for the development of curriculum. Now, I will point out that in your proposal, we don't actually ask you to submit a budget. We don't ask that. I've had some people ask me, like, no, we don't make you do that. So it's not like you're going to have to spell out how you're going to use the $5,000 if you get it, but know that we really want the money to go towards your research activities. That could include, providing you a stipend for your time to do the research. That could be, if you're part of a research team, maybe hiring an intern to do some work. You could use it for travel related to your research. Let's say you're in Indianapolis and you want to spend 3 days up in Gary going through an archive up there. You could use it for your mileage, for lodging, things like that. You could use it for your expenses for copying and digitization and such. So it should go towards your research activities, but know that we don't actually ask you for a budget. Finally, we'll talk about how to apply. I guess I shouldn't say finally, because I do have one more slide after this that I'm forgetting about. Let's focus on how you apply for the grant. I think it's important to go to our website to visit our Wilma Gibbs Moore Fellowship page. I've got the address spelled out there. That page has a call for proposals. Please read through that thoroughly. Much of the information is what I've presented today, so it won't be surprising to you, but have that in front of you and read through that carefully. The call for proposals has very specific instructions for how you prepare your proposal and how you submit it to us. You need to prepare it and send it to me, email it to me by March 31st. I'm going to give you a little bit of advice. Make sure if you send it to me that I send you an email back saying I got it. If you don't get that, let me know. I want to make sure that things don't go in spam. I'll be looking closely, but just be aware that if you send it, have me reply that I got it. Okay, do me that favor, because I want to make sure that we have your proposal. In your proposal, you're going to need to include a number of things. I'll just briefly highlight them. You need to provide a timeline, spell out how you're going to carry out the research over the year that you have to do it. All the work has to be done by June 30th, 2023. So come up with a timeline that's feasible and reasonable, because we'll look at that. I mean, part of it is judging the proposals is, can this work really be done the way the person is proposing it in the time frame presented? You're going to have to present your project description. I think we allow 5 pages for this. You need to talk about the significance of the project and how it aligns, especially with the fellowship goals. Really sell the importance of the project. We want you to identify the archives and collections that you use. And a very important component of this is that part about how do you think you're going to disseminate this, both via scholarly vehicles and through public sharing. So we'll ask for that. Again, all of this is spelled out in the call for proposals. There's a whole section on what you need to do to prepare your proposal. If you have questions, you can email me. Now, this is the slide I kind of forgot about a minute ago, but I've kind of thrown it in there. It's a little bit weird to put this in here, but I thought as I was preparing the slides for this, it might be helpful to look at the projects that we received last time, the proposals that we received, and share with you what didn't work, because I think that can illuminate some troubles, some pitfalls that you might avoid. As the scholars looked at the proposals last time, at least one or two of them, they felt like didn't really expand the knowledge of structural racism or racial injustice in Indiana. The stories were familiar. The researcher really was not proposing to bring anything new to it. So it's important that if you're proposing a topic, that it's really something that is going to present new information. In some cases, they felt that the proposal just really wasn't developed well. There may have been a seed of an idea, but in the course of the 3 or 4 or 5 pages that the researcher presented, they just didn't see how it was going to be carried out, or maybe they didn't feel like there was enough material there to really study and develop a really strong thesis. In some cases, in at least one case, I alluded this earlier, they just didn't feel that there was enough humanities focus. In this particular case, it was sort of a theme related to political science, but again, there was not enough of that humanistic contextualization behind it. It was, again, more on raw data, and that just didn't seem to align with the goals. In one case, the organization was really doing a survey of research and compiling it and like putting it into sort of a one consolidated place, or one resource where people could access it, but there was no actual research or new thought put into it. So keep that in mind, that surveys don't work. Consolidating knowledge really is not going to be a competitive proposal. I hope that those ideas give you some sense. Again, refer back always to the goals and the guidelines, keep those in mind, and I think that will help shape your work. Quickly, I'll talk about the timeline. Applications are due March 31st. We hope to have a decision by the first week in May and let you know that so you can start. If you get the fellowship, our goal is to give you the information and let you know that so you can start working during the summer. We do ask you to submit an interim report at the end of the year. If you get the fellowship, I will send you instructions on what that report looks like. And then finally, we will ask your final report by June 30th, 2023. And again, all work will be completed. If you have questions, I'll be glad to entertain them now. I think we have probably a few minutes before we talk to Jordan and Jasmine, or you can always email me. There's my email address, ghanlon@indianahumanities.org. My phone number is 317-616-9784. Feel free to give me a call, and I could talk to you over the phone as well.
George,
Okay, I see that there is a question in the Q&A. Does the primary researcher and/or research team need to be Indiana residents? That is a very good question. All of the people were based in Indiana last time. I suppose theoretically not. That is not a requirement. The requirement simply was that you have to be a US citizen and the work has to be focused on Indiana. So I would say, like, no, just make sure it's Indiana and it aligns with the goals that we spell out. I think that is the only open question that we have. But if you do have questions while Jordan and Jasma are presenting, then feel free to pop them in the Q&A or the chat and we can get back to those. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hopefully I will put my video back on while I talk to you. I'm going to introduce you now to a couple of our presenters. Again, Jordan Ryan and Jasma Sutton received fellowships in our fall 2022 award round, and they're going to talk to you today about their topics. They're going to share a little bit of what they studied, what the outcomes were, and how the fellowship supported them. I'll start first by introducing Jordan. Well, I'll introduce both of them. We'll have Jordan present first, and then we'll wrap up with Jasma. Jordan Ryan is an independent researcher based here in Indianapolis. They run a consulting firm called the History Concierge. They previously worked at the Indiana Historical Society, where they did a lot of research, developed exhibits, most recently an exhibit on Indianapolis's bicentennial. That's still up. If you go to the Historical Society, you can still see Jordan's work. Jordan focuses their research on the built environment, urban planning, historic preservation, marginalized communities, hostile architecture, and LGBTQ historic sites. We're really excited that Jordan, I think it was maybe late last year, Jordan, you received the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They present an American Express Aspire Award, and that award honors emerging leaders in the historic preservation field. It was a significant honor, and Jordan, we're really proud that you received that. Jordan did research on redlining around the city of Indianapolis, and they're going to present their research here in a moment. I'll also take the time now to introduce Jasma Sutton. Jasma is a PhD candidate at Indiana University Bloomington. She's wrapping up her work this summer. She has been studying historic Black settlement in Randolph County, Indiana, and into Darke County, into Western Ohio, looking especially at the women from that community and their descendants. Jordan's PhD is going to be in history, and I also believe that she studies gender studies as well. We're really excited that, I may have said Jordan there, Jasma, if I'm referring to Jordan, I'm really talking about Jasma. Jasma is going to be going down to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and she's going to be an assistant professor of history. So we're really excited that Jasma is going to spread her knowledge to college students as well. So I will be quiet here. I'm going to start first with Jordan and have Jordan, you pop on. Jordan, why don't you just start and tell us a little bit about your project and what you did?
Okay, thanks, George. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Shout out to Brittney and Lindsay. So my decision to apply for this fellowship was really based on my work at the Indiana Historical Society. I came to this because I had done some general redlining research for a 4-part program series I did to kick off the 2.5-year Indianapolis Bicentennial exhibit. And as many of you know, there's just not enough time sort of in the day-to-day of archival and museum work to really dive into certain things. So I had these lingering questions. And when the fellowship was presented, many people kept encouraging me to apply to sort of pursue some of these additional questions. So that's how I came about this. And my application, I'm kind of a literalist. I'm very data and maps and kind of straightforward. So I came to the application with 3 very specific questions and exactly how I wanted to solve them. So I was starting with an analysis of the Federal Housing Administration Manual. So that's sort of the federal department that was promoting redlining, right? So I wanted to break down this huge document and kind of pick it apart and look at some of the sensitive language and the way they were maybe covertly saying certain things, right? So that was my first question. My second question was looking at the actual area description forms. So these forms that the FHA and the real estate agents on the grounds were going around and surveying all of these census tracts to form the redlining maps that we all know, looking at that data, because it's one thing to kind of read a form and get the sense of what a census tract looked like in terms of population, residents, housing, amenities, that kind of thing. But it's kind of hard to toggle, 73 forms and remember all that data and how it could compare. So I wanted to manually transcribe, because I don't have access to a lot of fancy computer programs. So I just manually transcribed certain sections that I was interested in and then kind of transform the data on Excel. And then lastly, I actually don't really buy the argument about the houses themselves being sort of evaluated in redlining. So I wanted to do a visual analysis of what houses looked like in the 1930s. So when they were actually being evaluated. So looking through all the visual collections, studying areas, looking them up on the redlining map, putting them sort of in this key and comparing sort of the best and desired areas versus the redline areas. So I kind of wanted to do a bit of an audit, I guess, on the residential architectural side of things. So as I was going through all of that, I did end up having 2 more questions I had to sort of get into as well. So I added 2 additional sections to my report. One is on sort of a historiography revision. So there was some new information that had come out about how these different federal departments were formed and who actually did what and what records had been lost or trashed. So picking that apart, I felt was necessary. And then I also ended up doing a bit of a demographic data or audit. So I was looking at the redlined sections of Indianapolis and pulling the related population census data, and then pulling some current neighborhood data, because I wanted to have sort of a fast compiled list that we could use today to kind of understand certain areas that have 80 years of strategic disinvestment, right? So that's my report. It's really long. There's a lot of data.
26 pages, but we loved it.
Yeah, so I wanted to have something that other people could use. So I do have 2 public databases that are on the report. They're linked. I do have a business blog. So like I have a blog post about this report and I have links to the Google Docs so other people can use them, because I know it's really important to share this data, right? So you can actually access the area description forms. And then I have that running list of all of the images of residences and like the key. So if they were redlined or like if it was A, B, C, or D and like what section. So all that's available online. Hopefully keep sharing that and that will be useful to other scholars. So yeah, why does this matter? So my work really looks at spatial equity or spatial inequity, thinking about how all these different federal, state, and local housing policies impact how we get around today, where we live, where we can live, what amenities we have access to. And it really is sort of this cumulative impact of all of these things. So thinking about things today like subprime mortgages, rent-to-own schemes, low wages, limited access to capital, mortgage lending discrimination, gentrification policies, eviction laws, exclusionary zoning laws. All of this really impacts displacement, whether that's direct, indirect, perceived, instability of households and neighborhoods, rising property taxes, code enforcement issues, eviction rates, house flippers. There's all these predatory real estate practices that are happening today. And I wanted to layer different historic policies, not just redlining, but look at different things that have happened and not just Indianapolis, it's happening everywhere. But I really wanted to focus on Indianapolis because I think we're hungry for this content. My greater work kind of overlays redlining, racial covenants, urban renewal, downtown highway. So it's looking at all these different policies and then the impact today.
And Jordan, I will interrupt here to say, I think this is a really good example of where you're in a sense, you're looking at public policy and you're looking at sort of sociological issues. And this is an example of how you're exploring maybe what are not necessarily humanities subjects through a humanistic lens. And that, I think, serves as a good example of what I was talking about earlier. If you're looking at political science or sociology or some of those other social sciences, do so through a humanistic lens, because it just provides that context that we're so hungry for, so we can understand these issues more. So go ahead, I'm sorry.
Absolutely. And I find that everyone's kind of working in silos. And so my background is as an architectural historian, architectural archivist. So to me, it's very obvious where to go to find visual collections of something, but making that useful for other sort of purposes. And I know that kind of gets into the weird gray area of advocacy, but I don't really care. If something I do can help someone fight for better equitable housing development, then I'm going to do it. So that's kind of where I stand on that. And what I found kind of moving forward to sort of the public sharing component is that people were so hungry for this content that I ended up spending so much time presenting before I even could get into more of the research. So I've talked to Creative Mornings, the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana, MIBOR, Realtor Association, which was kind of shocking, right? The Patachu Foundation, Office of Community and Rural Affairs with the state of Indiana. White River Vision Plan people had me talk a little bit about redlining in my Broad Ripple Park and Riverside Park talks. I did, University of Indianapolis had a program series at the public library, so I did that. SKL Leadership Group have had me and some DMD staff in. I think redlining is just one sort of example of historic racist housing policies that really do explain the mess we're in today. And we are in an affordable housing crisis and a foreclosure crisis and an eviction crisis, and sort of just untangling this complicated web of policy and the market and banks and all the stuff. It really matters, because if people don't have access to stable, safe, secure, permanent housing, it disrupts every other aspect of your life. Housing is tied to everything. Your access to jobs, to healthcare, to education, to transit. We talk about food deserts. There's also credit deserts. Everything is tied to where you live. Where you live matters. So that's why I do what I do, because I see myself as kind of the archivist that can kind of pull the historic materials and help provide context, providing historic context to the advocates who are doing really great work today. So just wrap up my time and say that I think this fellowship is a great opportunity to sort of expand your professional network. I feel like it really helped kind of expand my credibility. People have been super receptive to this work. I feel like the Indiana Humanities team is great to work with. Anytime I had questions, I got assistance. I love working with this team, and I've been able to use this research to sort of work on other projects. So since then, the Fair Housing Center brought me in to do a fair housing exhibit on the history of discrimination in housing. So I got to use some of that redlining research in that. And then the Encyclopedia of Indianapolis brought me in to do a redlining feature story. So I'm working on that and kind of expanding all the great Polis Center data and maps and visualizations they have to help kind of visualize this story. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Jordan, we have a couple questions. First of all, someone in the chat wanted to know, you had mentioned a link where you had shared some of your research. with scholars, and someone is wanting to know if you could share that link. I'm sure that's in our report if I look it up, but I thought you might have some quicker access. If not, I will tell the person who posed that question to email me and I can get you that link through Jordan's report.
I will pull up the business blog post I did that links
Okay.
to the Google Docs if they want to look at my databases.
Okay, and then the next question is, when deciding on the public sharing aspect of your project, how did you identify the organizations or groups with whom you wanted to share your research? So when deciding on sharing it, how did you go about identifying the groups where you're going to distribute this information?
Pretty much everyone came to me, and that's mostly because of the great platform Indiana Humanities has. So just you all sharing your fellowship news, pretty much everyone saw that and contacted me that they wanted to learn more. I can't think of any circumstance where I kind of pitched it to a group. It was pretty much all your own marketing and comms.
Well, I will say it may be some of that, but also, Jordan, you have a really great reputation. You've been doing a lot of work in this arena and it's getting out there. And so some of it is your reputation. So
Thanks.
give yourself credit for that.
I'm a little mouthy on Twitter, so that could be part of it too. And
It's always good to be mouthy on Twitter, I think. So,
and I just dropped a link in the chat to my business website with the blog post with some of the data.
thank you for that. Jordan, thank you for being here. We're going to move on to Jasmine now. And Jasmine, why don't you tell us about your fantastic research that you did with the fellowship and share some insights around that?
Thank you, George. I am going to be sharing a presentation with you all, and in the typical historian fashion, I will be reading so introducing this anecdote that kind of puts my research into context. Then I'll go over my argument and what I am trying to do in my dissertation, and then speak more specifically about how the Wilma Gibbs Moore Fellowship supported me in that research endeavor. And so I'll share my screen now. Okay, so again, I'm happy to be here sharing my work with you and fortunate to have met and been introduced to this topic by Wilma Gibbs Moore herself. When I first got to Indiana University, I knew broadly that I wanted to focus on free and enslaved Black women in the 19th century, but I didn't know where to start or how to begin. And so I went to the Indiana Historical Society during one of my seminar courses where we had to do primary research. And there I met Wilma Gibbs Moore. She introduced me to the Greenville Black settlement through the book that you see over on the left. And as you can see, the book was processed at the Indiana Historical Society in 2010. And so using the Union Literary Institute as a starting point, I just continued to expand that research. I wanted to know who was the community, who was the Black community that created this institution? Why was it created? How and when did they get to Indiana? And how did they respond to a lot of the Black laws and racist policies that Indiana had put into place pretty much from its inception? And so the issue that I had from the very beginning is that there wasn't many records specifically related to the experiences of Black women. And so my research has been and continues to be this kind of investigation as to how I can bring the experiences and the voices of Black women to the fore by looking at early Black settlements in antebellum Indiana. And so for the next few minutes, I'll be introducing you to my dissertation, which is titled Borderline Freedom, Black Women in the Transition from Slavery to Freedom in Rural East Central Indiana Before the Civil War. Quote, "We are well contented, better satisfied than in Carolina," end quote. These are Hannah Elliott's words in an 1829 letter to Martha Parker, the one pictured here, about her and her children's living conditions in rural Eastern Indiana. And they are a testament to her negotiation of a narrow, difficult, but ultimately rewarding path to freedom. On a hot summer day in 1826, 37-year-old Hannah learned that the time had come for her to leave Perquimans County, North Carolina, where she was born in 1793. She was considered Quaker free, a status generally prescribed to enslaved people manumitted by Quakers. Legally, Hannah was not free. Her ability to live as a free woman resulted from a trusteeship of slaveholding developed by the Quakers around 1809. Viewing the state of North Carolina's constant rejection of their petitions as an impediment to their manumission efforts, the Society of Friends, or Quakers, formed a corporation to protect and govern their slaves. It may have been Hannah and her family's establishment of a home about 16 miles west of Richmond, Indiana, that triggered local white hostilities. The erection of a home signaled Black people's claim to land that white Hoosiers felt belonged to them. Furthermore, it represented Black migrants' vow to not be removed, excluded, or colonized from the state of Indiana. Historian Martha Jones asserts that a claim to place, to enter and remain within the nation's borders, was at its core citizenship. Influenced by Hannah and her family's arrival, the people of Wayne County, Indiana, quote, threatened to make it a slave state if Blacks continued to flock in, end quote. An old Quaker said he would pay $20 to get the family out of the county. Since Hannah was one of the earliest Black settlers in Wayne County, perhaps the hostile attitudes of local whites took a little time to escalate. Maybe it was Hannah and her husband Zango's success that incited white rage. Not only had they established a home, but by 1829, Hannah had secured work and education for her teenage daughter at a time when Black children were excluded from the public school system in Indiana. She had bore 2 more children and harvested, quote, a good crop. As historian Carol Anderson argues, the trigger for white rage inevitably is Black advancement. Hannah Elliott's life is a testament of how people with limited opportunities and limited freedom achieved the privileges of citizenship without the approval of the state. She was not among the wealthiest residents, but she fared better than other men and women and ultimately lived a fulfilled life. Hannah joined the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She attended church gatherings and took an active part in devotional exercises, quote, singing and shouting in the old plantation style with the real spirit of genuine delight. And I'm getting these quotes from the obituary printed in this newspaper here. And finally, she was remembered after death, the ultimate sign of achievement for Black women whose lives are seldom important enough to note in the historical record. According to Hannah's obituary, perhaps no person has died recently who is more widely known and respected among the elderly people of Eastern Indiana than this colored woman. In the same breath, the obituary insinuates that all she made of her freedom is, quote, indebted to the early anti-slavery efforts of the Friend Quakers, end quote. Hannah's achievements outside the service of Quakers are more than noteworthy, though. Like countless African Americans who sought out freedom and chose to stay in Indiana, despite the aggressions they encountered, Hannah Elliott negotiated the narrow confines of her freedom by simply staying put and asserting that she belonged. So my dissertation is about women like Hannah, who escaped the South through various means, coming through Quakers, fugitivity, or as free people who decided to make their new home in Indiana and somewhat in Ohio. So I'm interested in those women who escaped the South and came to and through rural Black settlements throughout East Central Indiana. I'm particularly interested in the Greenville Black settlement founded on the border of Randolph County, Indiana, and Darke County, Ohio in 1822 by recently manumitted slaves. And this is the home of the Greenville founders, James and Sophia Clemens. That is their descendants at the bottom, standing next to the historical marker that has been in recent years placed at the home. At the heart of my research are questions of freedom. I am conceptually most interested in understanding how Black women define ideas of freedom and citizenship across the antebellum period. My dissertation reveals that although the Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery in states like Indiana and Ohio, both states were unwelcoming to Black settlers and the idea of Black citizenship. In fact, Indiana was the most anti-Black state in the antebellum North, and as I argue, never truly free. The state was a volatile space that presented African Americans with the dual status of opportunity for advancement and vulnerability to threat. This was, as my title suggests, borderline freedom. The chapters of my dissertation explore how Black women navigated these social and legal barriers to develop ideas of liberty, carve out space for themselves as citizens, and ensure that their families survived on the Indiana frontier. Rural Black settlements, I contend, are a microcosm through which to examine a unique form of Black women's activism that emerged in secluded farming communities and was characterized by cultivating a home place, fighting for freedom in the Underground Railroad movement, and creating strategies of care and memory keeping across generations. Ultimately, I argue that Black women negotiated the confines of their freedom by developing a deep sense of belonging and success that did not depend on civic inclusion and mainstream recognition in Indiana. Although my research is grounded in archival research, it also highlights new ways to incorporate the practices of Black women in the work of public history. I introduced the method of descendant archival practice, which is a collaborative process of memory keeping between researcher and descendants. And the video that you're seeing on the screen here is an open access digital archive that I created in partnership with a few institutes at Indiana University to digitize and help preserve the heirlooms and artifacts that descendants from this community have kept in their homes. The method builds on the archival and preservation practices of descendant communities by identifying, preserving, making accessible, and digitizing their artifacts. My conceptualization of this process would not have been possible without the pivotal work of researchers like Wilma Gibbs Moore, who worked to bring attention to Indiana's rural Black settlements and their descendants who have worked tirelessly to preserve these family histories. And so how has the Wilma Gibbs Moore Fellowship supported me? I honestly could go on for days and days about how important this fellowship has been to my progress in the last 2 years of my PhD program and to many of the opportunities that I have been presented since being awarded the fellowship. And so I've used the funds to cover travel expenses, mainly to Darke County and Randolph County, Ohio. I've only driven there. It's about a 2.5-hour drive, and visiting the local historical societies there, as well as the descendants. In recent years, because I was having difficulty finding sources about these women in the archives, I extended my work to oral histories and to working more intimately with the communities. And so I've driven to Dayton, Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, Fountain City, Indiana, and back to Greenville, Ohio, to visit descendants at different times and talk with them about their family histories and the local family history work that they're currently doing. I've been able to attend conferences and support other research-related costs. And as far as the question that was asked about, how did Ryan decide where to disseminate her research, I feel like I had the same type of experience. I don't know if it's just an Indiana thing, but many of the people I've met at archives, local historians, etc., have been very generous in sharing my work. And that type of network has introduced me to so many opportunities at public libraries and different venues in which I've been able to share my research. Most recently, I hired an undergraduate student at Indiana University to transcribe some of the oral interviews I conducted with descendants of the community, including the woman who is pictured here in the red, sitting in a wheelchair. This is on the left side, her holding a photo of her grandmother, mother, and her mother's siblings. These transcripts have proven especially useful for the dissertation chapter I'm currently working on, which is the 3rd out of 4. So I have 1 more left to write, hopefully before the end of the semester, which explores the concept of home place on the frontier and Black women's material culture and memory work, which will lead me to my final slide. When I went to visit Mrs. Cleo in Columbus, Ohio, these are some of the photos that I took of the material culture that has been passed down from her great grandmothers to her, and which she keeps in her home today. And Miss Cleo is 96 years old, and I think that says a lot. I think she has a lot to say, and she holds a lot of the history that I have not always been able to find in institutional and mainstream archives. And so that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you for having me.
Jasmine, we're so delighted to have you talk, and I just think it's so powerful that you are out there not only utilizing collections that exist, but you are collecting materials and you're sharing. And if you don't mind, I know you've created that website where you're making some of the materials available. Would you share that in the link with folks so they could access it? If anybody has other questions for Jasmine that they want to post in the Q&A or the chat, please do so. And if you have any questions after the fact, you can always reach out to me, email me, and I can get you in touch with Jasmine and Jordan so they can share the information. Thank you, Jasmine. I appreciate that. Otherwise, if there are no other questions, I will say thank you all for being here today. We hope that this has been helpful to you. Again, take a look at those guidelines, the call for proposals that we have out there. They will be very helpful to you in spelling out what we're looking for. If you have questions in the next couple of weeks, reach out to me via phone or email, and I'll be glad to help you. Thanks to Jordan and Jasmine for being here. Thanks to all of you for being here. This has been a wonderful experience, especially listening to Jordan and Jasmine. I don't think it's been wonderful listening to me, but I've certainly enjoyed hearing from them. And we are grateful for the time and attention that you've all given us today. With that, we'll close the webinar and thank you all very much. Goodbye.